Welcome to our session, Faculty Leadership in Advancing Equity, Our Roles and Responsibilities in Transforming Reward Systems. I hope everyone enjoyed this morning's framing and keynote. I found them both extremely thought-provoking, and I'm excited to bring that conversation back to my campus. I am Cynthia Lynch, the Executive Director of the Center for Civic Engagement and Berry Institute of Politics at Salem State. I am today's moderator, and I'm here with Professor Raúl Gutierrez of Holyoke Community College, librarian Asher Jackson of Fitchburg State University, Professor Christina Santana of Worcester State University, and Associate Provost Amit Taneja of the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. In a moment, our panelists will introduce themselves and we will proceed with the panel. I have prepared several questions for them to address, and the Q&A function is open for all of you to add your questions to, and I will relay to them. This weekend, like most of you, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on my mind. RBG was a tireless advocate, making her mark on the world by using her personal and professional agency and an equity-focused lens to transform our culture in the areas such as same-sex marriage, gender discrimination, reproductive health, to name a few. She was a trailblazer, no doubt. But we all have that ability in our own worlds, at our individual institutions, using our personal and professional agency to advance equity on our campuses. It is our responsibility regardless of our individual roles. So how does change occur on a college campus? And specifically in this case, in the area of faculty reward systems. We heard a lot about that from our framer and our keynote speaker. But what needs to happen for there to be equitable, sustainable transformation in our reward systems so that both faculty of historically minoritized identities and faculty doing newer forms of scholarship feel the system is inclusive of their work, and that they stop running into the biases like Carrie-Ann O'Meara spoke about earlier as they try to fit into a world created on a white male model. What are the policies and practices that need to be enacted or changed to ensure an inclusive and equitable faculty reward system? And what is our role as faculty and staff in making this happen? Policies and practices both need to happen in concert with each other to create this sustainable cultural change. Two quick concrete examples from our state system that show the need for policies and practices to simultaneously work together to bring about the necessary cultural change. In our last MSc contract, this is the contract that guides the Mass State University faculty, it was written into policy that community engaged teaching scholarship service will be recognized in the tenure, promotion, and post-tenure review process. While this sector-wide language is exciting and full of potential, it is only a policy, and until it is put to practice on the 9 campuses, it will not produce the intended cultural change. This year, through a Department of Higher Ed grant, we have started to operationalize this policy and are beginning to put the policy language into practices on several of our campuses, 2 that you will hear from this morning on our panel. The second example occurred several years back when there was a lot of momentum on one of our campuses to transform how community engaged teaching and newer forms of scholarship were being valued. Lots of professional development occurred, a faculty learning community focused on this topic. However, through a series of leadership changes that were accompanied by new visions, this initiative got sidelined. Unfortunately, it was just being put into practice and there was no corresponding policy and the momentum ended. No lasting change. While these examples are brief, the message is clear that in order to advance equity by transforming our reward systems, we must attend to both policies and practices and be committed to having them work together to create the necessary cultural change on our campuses. As a way of introducing our panelists, I would like each panelist to introduce themselves and speak to how you, in your role on campus, have worked through your institution to change policy and or practice with regards to faculty reward systems. I'm going to ask that you try to stick to around 4 to 5 minutes so that we each have time, so that we have time to do Q&A. So let's begin with Professor Raúl Gutierrez. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Raúl Gutierrez, and I'm an associate professor of Latinx Studies and Spanish at Holyoke Community College. And the way that basically I work through my institutions to change policy and practice regarding is through creating a program that's anchored in Latinx studies that requires civic engagement. When you work in a community college, publication is not a requirement. It's look good, but you don't have to do that. So as a result, we were trying to create, how do we engage the community within the framework of our own institution? So as a result, in collaboration with a lot of colleagues, including the coordinator for our service learning program, we discussed how to create these connections between an actual area of study and civic engagement, and how that could be mimicked or copied by other folks and other departments regarding creating a civic engagement piece to their curriculum. So as a result, we helped create a experiential learning model that basically plugs in this possibility of people doing work in the community while learning and participating in an academic area. Also, the grounding of Latinx studies allows us to be basically the study of Latinx studies is always activism and scholarship connected to the community. It's not unanchored. So, but yeah, so I've been doing that. I've been doing service learning in all my classes since I think 5 years ago I started when I was, and I work directly with the folks with the service learning program at HCC to basically try to help and basically for the institution to see the worth, especially at this time of budget cuts, of these programs, and that how to participate and for folks to be more participatory in their community that we are housing, which is largely people of color. Especially in my experience in Holyoke, Holyoke has 50% of Latino, more than 50% Latino population, mostly Puerto Rican. So how do we engage that community within the college so they can basically go through HCC and then move on to a 4-year school if possible and have this understanding of activist scholarship.
Super. Thank you, Raul. Okay, now I'm going to turn and ask librarian Asher Jackson to introduce himself. You need to unmute.
My apologies. Hi, it's a pleasure to see you all again. It's nice to be here today. I have a long title. I'm a reference and instruction librarian in the archive, and I'm also the university's archivist. So I also, I'm a reference and instruction librarian in the library, I apologize, and also run the university's archive. So I kind of serve a dual purpose. And one of the reasons why I was really interested in being involved with this is because I want to look at the ways that we can change the way we view community engaged research. And I started thinking about the ways in which the library and the university archive can be a mechanism to legitimize this type of research. We are in the middle of looking at ways to change the system right now, and we're actually in the middle of proposing ways to make sure this type of scholarship has the same regard in terms of tenure, promotion, reappointment and other things as other types of research. So we are looking at, number one, for me, from my perspective, the way the library and the archive can turn community-based scholarship into an institutional asset, the way that we can make it sit alongside of other types of research and be used alongside of other types of research by faculty, by students, by external scholars from other locations. So what I am saying as an archivist and as a librarian is, we go out into the community to gather all types of research and always have. Community engagement is a part of what we do. It's a part of how we find primary and secondary scholarly resources. So if that is the case, if that is a norm for an institutional archive or library, then it also needs to be the norm that that type of faculty research is respected and is seen as equal to other types of research. And we want to be a mechanism for that. We want to be a way that that gets legitimized. So in addition to that, in addition to looking at the way that certain institutional mechanisms can help faculty legitimize their scholarship and make it as highly regarded as any other type of scholarship, we've also been working to propose the establishment of a Center for Faculty Equity and Inclusion on campus that would serve a slightly different role from the traditional Center for Teaching and Learning. It would really look at equity and inclusion for faculty, and it would include things like looking at tenure and promotion, looking at mentorship, looking at scholarship, and figuring out how to address and advocate for the things that marginalized or minority, or however you want to phrase it, scholars do as a part of traditional academic practice. We are also looking at a strategy to make sure that tenure and promotion committees are inclusive. So we don't know that we can necessarily require that certain types of people be assigned to be on it, and we wouldn't necessarily want to do that. But how do we really work towards making our tenure and promotion and reappointment committees more inclusive? How do we get key people from marginalized groups onto those committees, and how do we support their work on those committees? We are also working with the vice president. We're working with the vice president of academic affairs on both of these issues. We're also working with our union chapter here at Fitchburg State, and we're also working with the Center for Faculty Research and Publication. And this is something that, in addition to those of us who are interested in this work, the library itself is really a supporting piece of the Center for Faculty Research and Publication. We host book publication events, we host scholarly writers series, scholarly research series, things like that. So again, we're trying to become a regular part of the scholarship that happens on campus and really make sure that all voices are included and all voices are seen as equally legitimate.
Thank you, Asher. And I also want to mention that both Asher Jackson and Professor Christina Santana were part of the Higher Education Innovation Grant we got from the DHE to try to operationalize the policies that were written into the MSCA contract. So with that, I'm going to introduce Professor Christina Santana.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm happy to be here. My name is Christina Santana. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of English at Worcester State University. I'm focused on writing. I teach community writing, professional writing, grant writing. I'm also the director of the Writing Center, and I'm currently the chair of the Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity Committee. In my 4 years at Worcester State, I worked to help students build their capacity to work with nonprofits, for example, to develop deliverables that positively impact the efforts of the organization and enable students to take on a consulting role. Similarly, I train students to work in the Writing Center to support their peers in becoming better writers. As a community engaged scholar, I'm steeped in the question of when does my work count as scholarship if traditional audiences, journals, and publications are not our primary targets? And for me, the change in the contract signals that we are asking this question together now. In other words, I participated in the HEF grant that Cynthia mentioned because I wanted to approach tenure as confidently as possible and enable like-minded colleagues to do the same. So my team was myself, Dr. Tanya Mears from the History and Political Science Department, and Dr. Meghna Dillip from Chemistry, as well as our Director of Civic Engagement. So together we took on a series of activities, the first of which was a faculty survey. We wanted to understand what the faculty were thinking, what they were aware of. We learned that 8.3% of faculty had read and understood that the change in the contract language had happened. 26% were familiar with community engaged scholarship, so that was pretty good. We learned also that 33% of the faculty were felt like Worcester State was supportive of community engaged scholarship. That was a sense that I had coming into Worcester State. It's part of why I chose to work at Worcester State. So largely the sense is that it's a positive space for community engaged scholarship. That sense was multiplied when we had our next event, which was a leadership tea. We had the president, the provost, department heads. It was a really well-attended event. And the sense again was that there's wide support for community engaged scholarship that's happening on campus and for the valuing of that work in the contract language. So it was all very positive, and certainly it is. The concern though is, when things get, sort of muddy, we want to make sure that everyone's sort of on the same page. The next step beyond the faculty or the leadership team was a discussion with faculty. We invited everyone in that was interested to learn about the grant goals and to invite input. We then met with HR and marketing, and we were able to weigh in on a series of documents to help determine whether those documents were highlighting the fact that CES is valued at Worcester State. We looked at the Worcester State perspectives. We looked at the ad in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, the one-page job description, as well as language on our interview exchange platform, just to make sure that it was informed by the goals of the grant. Next, we had a team retreat where I met Asher actually and Cynthia. And so the teams from Fitchburg State, Salem State, and Worcester State, we all got together and we shared what we were up to on our campuses. That event helped us determine our next step. So we began at that time developing a document that we wanted to share at personnel luncheons. These are events where the deans meet with faculty to help them prepare their materials for tenure and promotion. So the document had 3 specific goals. One was to communicate the change in the contract language. As I mentioned earlier, only 8% of faculty even knew about the change. So we wanted to provide a document that would be handed out at those events, faculty to understand that the language had changed, there was support for this, to offer some definitions. That's sometimes where things get muddy. We also wanted to contextualize this change within a recruitment and retention diversity inclusion framework. As you might have heard this morning from Dr. O'Meara, faculty of color tend to do this work more. So we wanted to then, as our third goal, articulate the sobering reality that, if an evaluator at any of the 7 levels of the T&P process is unfamiliar with the techniques or methods of community engaged scholarship, this will have a disproportionate effect on faculty of color, which is a reflection of institutional and structural racism. So that document was trying to do that work. Unfortunately, COVID happened and we were not able to distribute it. It's still the plan, just haven't gotten there yet. Our last event, which we just finished on Friday, was a cross-campus conversation. We had faculty, we had a lot of BIPOC faculty, and then T&P committee members from Fitchburg State and Worcester State. We had 22 participants. We had 3 speakers. We had 4 breakout sessions. It was great. I want to share with you just a couple of takeaways from that experience. There was a real acknowledgement that CES faculty must ensure that their work is legible. And that's ground, right? I really appreciated that. There was a desire for literacy training. Much of that we've touched on a little bit here today. So training of chairs, training of PEC, peer evaluation committee, training of TMP members, tenure and promotion committee members, so that they understand that this is a paradigm shift, that we want to help them make good decisions to support faculty who are doing this work. So there for literacy training, there was a palpable sense that the conversation that we hosted, the workshop, was appreciated and valuable, which was wonderful. There was also the realization that as allies, as those participating in the work, and Asher just sort of mentioned this, that we need to be taking these seats on T&P committees as often as possible. So if we're not able to provide as much as we can, in literacy training, or that it hits a wall in some way, we are taking those seats and we are acting as advocates for each other. Our next steps is to continue with the commitments of the grant. We are out of funds now, but we might get more funds. But the idea is just sort of to keep this machine in motion, especially given the interest. We also plan to distribute some of the useful documents that we developed. I know some really great stuff was developed at Salem State and Fitchburg State, and I'd like to think that the document that we created at Worcester State will be helpful. So we plan to connect with the other state institutions to get that information out there and to support others in this effort. And then finally, we just really want to plan to activate local support and generate new partners to continue the conversation. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Professor Santana. That very comprehensive and really filled us in a lot on the grant that we've been working on for the last year. So thank you. And now I would like to introduce Associate Provost Amit Taneja to introduce himself and talk about his work.
Great. Thank you, Professor Lynch. I want to start by thanking Professor Lynch and Campus Compact for creating this space. I am wearing my Ruth Bader Ginsburg tie so I can channel her and speak truth to power, hopefully. I found the keynote in the morning really, really helpful, and I was thinking about the larger structural issues. But I also think maybe part of starting to do this work is reflecting on our own journey and to be able to name the ways in which our own education may have come from a colonized framework. So I'll start with a quick example. When I was early on in my doctoral program at Syracuse University, there was a murder of Letitia Green, who was a Black transgender woman who lived in the city of Syracuse. And one of the things I came quickly to realize that lots of faculty who wrote about, spoke about, and researched violence against queer people were happy to have panels and symposiums and all those kinds of things, but nobody wanted to show up when the violence was happening in our own backyard, right? So I recognized early on as a doctoral student that the reward and evaluation structures of the academy were at deep odds with my own personal values, and also deeply rooted in performative allyship, which is a larger symptom, I would argue, of the neoliberal university. So if we want to really do this work deeply, I would encourage all the folks who are attending today to think about the ways in which we have been taught to devalue community against scholarship, right? So that's maybe a starting point. We will get into this a little bit later, but I would argue, right, we have a current crisis in higher education as public perception and some reality of higher education is that we're not seen as a public good, right? People are questioning the value of higher education. So it's important that we frame this work as crucial to the survival of higher education, as opposed to something that would be nice or we're trying to tweak, right? It has to be very central to our very ethos, to our argument for why we exist. One of the things I like to say is that there is a huge disconnect between our values and practices in the academy. So one tongue-in-cheek example I like to use is that even though every single one of our institutions likely proclaims that we are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it is hard for many of those institutions to put those values in practice. Just in the same way that I think physical exercise is good for your heart, mind, and body, it does not mean that this pretty face gets up and goes to the gym every day, right? It doesn't happen. So can we imagine a world in which the CEO of Staples would say that selling paper is the most important thing that we do as a company? It's one of our core values. And yet when it comes time to evaluate people, that there is not a single question that asks how much paper did you sell, right? So that's like kind of, it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek example, but that's what I think happens in higher education. We say we value diversity, equity, and inclusion, yet in our faculty evaluations and our staff evaluations, we are not really creating the structures, the policies, the programs to really value that work when it comes to employee evaluation and reward structures. So that's part of the framing. When I think about culture, I think about the 4 Ps, the personnel, the policies, the procedures, and the programs. And so we can get into it more, but so if we're thinking about personnel, I think one of the issue with one of the things that I think I would like to expand our framework on is that we're starting this conversation after faculty are on our campus and then saying, how can we support this work? But I think it actually starts in the hiring process, right? So what are we doing in the hiring process that actually values community engaged scholarship and lifts it up as something that we want to hire people for, not something that we want to tolerate or accept. So that may be the personnel part of it. For policies, we can get more into the tenure and promotion policies that value this work. If you want to look at some examples, Kenyon College in Ohio has actually passed some policies that actually incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion work in their tenure and promotion work. If we want to think about procedures, we should think about, sort of who is getting elected to the Committee on Tenure and Promotion, how are they being trained, how is that information being shared and discussed with departments before a tenure and promotion report is written. And if we're thinking about the 4th P, which is programs, how is the leadership of the institution setting up structures to value this work? So for example, at Holy Cross, we have the Scholarship in Action grant that is really trying to reward faculty for working with the community and tries to break down these rigid silos of teaching, scholarship, and service as 3 completely separate things, but tries to kind of, bring them together. So with that, I'll pause.
Thank you so much, Associate Provost Taneja. That was really interesting. So now we've kind of gotten to our question and answer portion, and we've had a couple of Q&As come in. So I'm going to begin with the ones that have come in, and then I will go to some that I have prepared if we have time. So the first one is for you, Asher Jackson. It's how do you envision the composition of the proposed Center for Equity and Inclusion? In particular, how would the new center add to or counteract the relative growth in administrative over faculty positions in recent decades? How might it provide a space for marginalized faculty to more fully integrate into campus life? And finally, how might it help increase collaborative work among faculty? So there's a lot there. And you're on silent.
I apologize. Those are all really good questions. I'm going to have to give fairly brief answers, so I apologize in advance for my brief answers. But we really are actually working right now to really talk about how we envision the composition of the center, primarily because we don't want it to be a silo where the people who are doing, community-based work go where minorities go, right? We want it to be somewhere where that type of work is featured and where minority faculty have a chance to have conversations and kind of work together. But we also want exposure, right? We want to invite people in to take a look at what is done. So we're still tooling with the composition in a way that makes sure that it doesn't stay inside a group of people who are already doing this type of work and already all understand each other. So that's one thing we are looking at pretty carefully right now, because we need to be viewed externally as valid, right? And we need our practice and our research to be viewed as valid externally to the group. So we're still looking at composition. Relative growth of administrative or faculty positions in recent decades, that is a really good question. And I will say here, because I have tenure and I can't be fired today, that this is a huge, well, not huge, it is a growing problem at our institution. And it is a recent growing problem at our institution. So I don't know how we can counteract it, but I do know that We are working very closely with the VPAA, who actually fully supports the direction that we're headed in. He's not sure exactly how his office can support it either, or kind of how ultimately this will all shake out in terms of kind of an institutional space. But he is looking at, I'll say it this way, this is an attempt kind of at the VPAA level and below to take back some of the power for the way our work is viewed. So we are kind of taking back control and saying we want this work to happen, but we also want to be the ones who articulate the value of this work and articulate and contextualize how it should be interpreted, right? So in terms of counteracting an administrative point of view, I think that's the biggest thing we can do right now. One of our big pressures is actually external validation. They keep asking for external validation for our work as faculty and librarians. And so this, our counter argument is we need to have more power in kind of evaluating and interpreting this and then contextualizing it for external audiences. Otherwise, how are they going to validate it? They don't know what they're looking at either. How might it provide a space for marginalized faculty? Again, that leads back to the first question that I tried to answer, which is we're trying to make sure that there is integration and not just kind of a separated group of people that are all validating each other, but then still have to struggle with other faculty in the institution and administrators in the institution to make sure that it's seen as valid outside of the group. So again, this is a place I think where I really saw an opportunity for the library to work closely with Center for Faculty Publications, Center for Teaching and Learning, so on and so forth, the Vice President of Academic Affairs Office, to showcase this type of work and to make sure that it gets seen and heard publicly. And I think that's where a lot of value or appreciation for the work that gets done happens, is just showing it. And making people aware that this is a common thing. How might it help increase collaborative work among faculty? We don't know. That's the hope, but that's one of the things we'll be tracking is how do people respond to it? At what point do they say, I want to be a part of this? So this first phase is really tracking that response to it and seeing how people might want to work together. Again, and this is based on the fact that our departments, our academic departments at Fitchburg State are actually fairly small. Some of them are as little as 1 or 2 faculty members that represent an entire department. So they already kind of are overwhelmed and don't know what anyone else is doing. So what we're doing is trying to provide avenues for exposure and avenues for each other just to sit down and talk.
Thank you, Asha. It's great to see all of this great practice and work coming out of a policy that was put into our our faculty contract and kind of the outgrowth of where the work can go. So thank you. We have a couple other questions that have come in. This one's gotten a couple of likes to it, so I guess a bunch of people want us to ask this. So, and this one is to any of the panelists. On the practice side, how do we have our institutions recognize the time, and that's in capital letters, that it takes to develop relationships with community before we are able to show any concrete results? Sometimes it takes years to develop these relationships of trust. It's challenging. And I was saying, how do we value it? I'm just going to kind of add to that. How do we then account for it in our tenure and promotion processes when it is so often a prescribed mechanism? So jump in, panelists. Unmute yourselves if you want to add to that. And then anyone?
I think that this is
Perfect, thank you.
This is at the center of the issue beyond like because it does take a lot of time, especially with universities or colleges that have contentious relationship with the community. So it becomes very difficult to actually like go into the community and say like I represent so and so. and theoretically attract students or other folks from the high school to work with us. Oh, yeah.
Super. Thanks, Raul. Does anyone else want to chime in on that? Christina.
I'd like to chime in just really quickly. I'm always thinking about evidence. So I know so I go up for tenure next year, but with our pre-tenure binders, I've printed emails and framed those emails so that I can show a timestamp and that I am managing that relationship. So as much as I can find opportunities to gather evidence, I'm doing that. So I would encourage anything you can point to. If it's an event, right? If you're doing similar binders, I would encourage that.
Excellent, thank you. And just kind of going off on what Christina said, that also includes letters from the community partners you are working with, because we always think to ask faculty leaders and your department chairs for letters in the TMP process, but I have many faculty that I work with that I say, go ask your community partner to write a letter that speaks to the work, that speaks to the policy briefs you've written on and so forth. So again, those are good people to turn to. Okay, so the next question we have is for Professor Gutierrez. Okay, at the community college level, is engaged scholarship even considered in the hiring process? Also, is there a place that the college could acknowledge the faculty's community-based learning, maybe in the dean's evaluations?
Well, when I got hired, I wasn't asked, or there was no reference to doing civic engaged work at all. I don't believe it is a requirement or in the hiring process at all. I've been in other searches for faculty, and that's not one of the parameters in most cases. It is. We have at HCC a very vibrant service learning program that does have incentives for faculty that participate in it. They have mentoring programs, but after the first semester, when you opt in to do this type of work, they give you a stipend, and then after that, there's no more like monetary compensation or time taking one class or so on and so forth. So as a result, it becomes like people opt in, but it becomes almost unmanageable after, because you have some other things. So I recently got tenured, and I know that my dean particularly did write my work with the community, but it was not a necessary, it was an add-on, because my dean was aware how active I was in the community. So it should be included, and it also should be incentivized, I think. But because we're a union shop, this is something that and I know that other folks have mentioned unions, this is something that it needs to be restructured in our contract for folks that do this work to be considered part of their load of work that they do, and create some sort of space. And this is going to take a lot of education of this is constant in our college, education to our administration and our administrators regarding how this is incentivized and how this work is viewed. But yes, no, the answer to both is no and no. But like it is mentioned, but it's college service. I think that's what it gets under. But it's you can do anything for college service almost. But yeah.
Thank you. I know it is different depending on institution types and private, public, and so forth, which is why policies are so important and why making sure we operationalize policies are needed in this work. Another question we have, as a follow-up on the earlier question we had, the question is, how do we value the often invisible labor of mentoring students of marginalized background or identities? And that's open to anybody.
Sure. I mean, I think that's one of the core issues, right, for historically marginalized faculty, because they're tasked with that invisible labor. So I have a couple ideas on that. There are some institutions that have started at least quantifying the more visible forms of labor, so that if you're in a particular committee that takes up 3 hours a week, you get a certain number of points, and when you hit 6 points, you can be asked to do more service. And so that's a model that's a little new to me, but I know other institutions are doing that. And that is actually to put a check so that historically marginalized faculty are not asked over and over and over and over again to serve on the committees, to meet with the trustees, to do this presentation. It's all that somewhat invisible and actually visible labor, putting some stop measures so that we're not asking too much of it. I recently heard from a colleague who said that it wasn't until the point when she sat herself on the committee on tenure and promotion that she realized, right? Or was that said earlier today too, that other people were not being asked to do that level of service, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is also creating structures, I think, as I would argue, even when we're trying to do community-engaged scholarships, community-engaged scholarship, and encourage our students to do that, we are often replicating those power structures and asking students to do that work in addition to their classwork, right? And it can, so is there ways in which we can create structures so there's paid internships for doing this work, or they're getting academic credit, or both, right? That's the most ideal way in which we can replicate, right? So that might be a second way to do that. The third one is actually creating policies, practices, and personnel, and this maybe runs a little bit in tension between faculty positions and administrative positions, where there is support for historically marginalized students that is met by staff members, right? So, for example, at a previous institution that was a little isolated, faculty of color were waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to drive students to the airport, which was an hour away, when they had to go home for breaks and stuff like that. That is not a good use of faculty time, right? But if the institution is willing to commit some resources, we can create those structures so that kind of support does not fall on faculty in those moments.
There's a quick follow-up on that I want to get to, and then I'll go on to the next. Is it possible to name some of the institutions that are quantifying invisible or visible labor?
Don't quote me on this, but I want to say Gettysburg College has done this, but it's either Gettysburg or Grinnell. It's one of the G colleges. So I can look it up, and it's somewhere in my notes. I just found out about this last week, so I haven't looked into it myself yet.
Okay, thank you. We'll look into it and get the information, at least to Campus Compact, so that they can put it out. Thank you. Okay, so now we have, can anyone comment on the issue of institutions wanting to use community engaged scholarship for public relation purposes, but not valuing it for the individual faculty or program? Excellent question. Any takers?
I remembered it was Davidson College, so sorry to go back to the original question. It was Davidson. Coffee is finally kicking in, so. I'll say one quick thing here, right? This is something that the college, more and more colleges want their alumni to hear these fun stories. So I think there's ways in which faculty can be proactive and actually go to your media relations department and say, I want you to tell this story. But start writing about it early on in your tenure and promotion narrative, right? Write about it in your second year review, in your fourth year review, so that you're kind of training the department to say, look, this work is valued by the college. And if they don't comment on it in your second year review or your fourth year review, then you can ask the department chair some question. Hey, I'm getting some mixed messages right here from the institution where this work is being held up, right? Have that conversation with your dean of faculty before you get to your promotion case or tenure case.
I was lucky to be chosen as a Civic Engaged Scholar through the Northeast Campus Compact. So I've been working with faculty from Ivy Leagues, four-year schools, community college, and we ran the gamut of so many different institutions, but we all discuss this basically having photographs of the work of folks do on the web page, and so on and so forth. The representation of service learning or civic engagement work as something positive, but yet in the actual processes. So this is across the board in most institutions, based on anecdotal information regarding having conversations with my peers in this particular cohort of folks. But everyone said that it is something that is a good selling point, but in the process of appreciation, the faculty or the departments that do this work, it's another thing. So it's separated. So there's sending mixed signals. So this is good work, but yet is not taken into account for promotion or tenure. And
Super, thank you. Others that want to chime in? Any other thoughts? Okay, I will move on. Okay, actually this is more of a comment, and it says, thank you for mentioning the union. We can do the very minimum for 6 years, and 10 years almost automatic. College service is limited to what the contract requires, and any additional engagement or community connection means nothing. And that is the feeling that so often is heard on all of our campuses, 2-4 year private and public. And that is really this work that we're trying to do, which is bring publicly engaged scholarship and the work of new forms of scholarship to be valued. I guess with about 10 minutes left in this, I really want to put it out here to all of you, and I'll to kind of say, what is some of the low-hanging fruit that we as faculty and staff, who are really the audience right now, can do to move the policies and practices forward. So I'm gonna start, Christina or Asher. Thoughts, folks? Raul, Asher, Amit. Anyone want to chime in on some low-hanging fruit we can work on?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in. So,
Thanks,
really on the back of our event on Friday, I've had lots of conversations about what do we do now? How do we continue conversations? What can we put in place ASAP? Something that I'm really excited about is getting those materials from the other institutions and thinking about, is there a place for a Center for Equity and Inclusion on our campus? Or where on campus is that work happening now, so that we can pull threads together potentially, and then see if there are other individuals who want to shed a little bit more light on the connection between valuing non-traditional scholarship in the tenure and promotion process. So really just getting more voices together and trying to act upon the momentum that we currently have, and hopefully more momentum from this event here today as well, right? Just building some bodies together is the idea.
Thank you, Christina. To add a little bit to that, to really jump off on what Professor Santana said, one of the things we're doing as part of that same grant is we are having a meeting in about 3 weeks with all of the department heads, all of the folks in all levels of the evaluation process, to say, we now have a policy. Faculty are being trained, junior faculty, to use this policy as they go through their tenure and promotion process. How can we support you in understanding the different nuances of the process, so that we could try to start eliminating some of the biases and barriers that were spoken about earlier? So different trainings and meetings, working with your provost and associate provost, who our meeting was with, to move this forward is important. And so.
I have one more thought I'd like to share that came really out of our conversation today. I think one document that we haven't created yet or talked about creating is potentially an FAQ, frequently asked questions about CES scholarship and opportunities for value on campus. So there are a couple questions I think that a lot of people have. Like one, how do we value the often invisible labor of mentoring students, and then, you know, how do we ensure that our relationship management work is seen? So I think a lot of people have those questions, and so if we put together a document like that, or, you know, got other people involved in gathering some of those basic questions, it might just, again, help shed a little bit of light on how we can make the most use of this new opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yes.
I'll go back to the question of low-hanging fruit. We had created a faculty committee on emerging forms of scholarship, and that was actually both looking at community engaged scholarship, but also was looking at digital humanities, for example, right? And what was most helpful about that is that when you're doing that as an institutionally structured committee, that you're actually spreading these conversations across departments and faculty, right? So we can have all the policy changes in the world, they're not going to guarantee cultural change. For example, we have had non-discrimination policies around race and racism at all of our institutions for decades, and yet it still exists, right? So part of this whole project is to change institutional culture, and that requires kind of spreading the wealth a little bit. I noted in the chat that the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity has some excellent resources that comes at many of these topics, whether it be invisible service or getting your scholarship recognized or navigating the politics of the tenure promotion process. They have lots and lots of good webinars. And so if you're looking for low-hanging fruit, that may be a interesting resource to build out for all your faculty. And yeah.
Super. Okay. Another a comment question that came in to Christina. Thank you, Christina. That would be great, especially for those of us who need the guidance in advocating for ourselves at the upper level of leadership. For example, how do we push for a change in our contract, i.e. course load, based on evidence of our work in the climate of being told that we should just be grateful to have a job? That's, you know, I hear that's what's being heard out there. It's, you know, we are being told that. I would say looking at the low-hanging fruit that we're talking about, working with support systems. So for instance, out of this grant, the next steps are going to be, we started with 3 institutions. How can we go to the other 6 institutions with the documents created at Worcester State that Christina was talking about, with the information on the new centers that Asha had spoken about? How can we go to the other 6 institutions and then branch out to the community colleges as well as private institutions in our state and in our neighboring states to start sharing the information and strategies that we are working on? And again, share the story, write about it, publish on it, and make sure that this work is being heard far and wide. Just checking. Another question that came into
institutional resources play a lot. Like, so there, I have to name the reality that some institutions are more financially well-resourced than others. So I just want to start by naming that as a disparity that exists to begin with, but there are institutions that have resources to be able to have certain amount of course releases available, or grants available when people take pre-tenure leaves, if pre-tenure leave is even a thing, or even post-tenure leave for that matter, for sabbaticals. But part of it is that, again, you know, sort of keep going back to the leadership of the institution, you know, ask if you can figure out, you know, part of this is political organizing in some ways as well, right? So if there are faculty who are engaged in community engaged scholarship, if they can have their own group, and then once the group is in place, ask to meet with the provost and president, ask to meet with your faculty representatives of your shared governance structures, right? and try to have conversations with them so that this work is being elevated and valued by the institution, and you're advocating for more resources. It's very hard to do that if you are in an adjunct position and if you're not tenured. So I want to name that as the power structure that would make that hard difficult.
Absolutely. Power structures are such an important part of navigating this entire practice, which is what makes it, it's kind of the catch-22, what makes it so hard for junior faculty to say, I want to do this work that I know is, meets the core values of my beliefs, but yet I also want to get tenure and promotion in a system that really says we want traditional Eurocentric research, So we have one final thought that I'm going to read before we close out, as how do we eliminate the personal opinion of the evaluator affecting the evaluation of the faculty member? And again, that goes towards the biases that was spoken about earlier in the keynote and throughout this panel. And because we are out of time, I'm just going to say, again, it's through, just as Amit just mentioned, it's really through talking to department heads, deans, provosts, and trying to build a team of allies on your campuses, in your systems, through your communities to work on this and show the evidence how this is changing the communities, impacting social good, and really making incremental change in your communities. Looking at the time, I want to be mindful that I don't want to take from your lunch time. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank our participants and all of your questions, Campus Compact for hosting. The next step is for everyone to go enjoy lunch, refresh, and then come back for some exciting sessions this afternoon. Thank you.